This week marks 6 months since the political party funding bill was sent to President Cyril Ramaphosa. The bill forces political parties to declare donations and will also establish a multi-party democracy fund for donations from private sources. Civil rights organizations believe it will improve transparency and accountability, especially with the elections looming large. Lawson Naidu from the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution joining us now live from our Cape Town studio. So Lawson, 6 months it's been since this bill landed on the president's desk. Should we be concerned?
I think we should. It's, the president has had ample time to apply his mind to the legislation that is before him, awaiting his signature. And I think this, highlights one of the gaps in the Constitution, in that there is no time limit within which the president is required to sign pieces of legislation that have been passed by both houses of Parliament. And this is an important piece of legislation. And as you say, with an election on the horizon within the next 5 months or so, it is of a matter of urgency that the president should put pen to paper on this, so that the necessary arrangements can be made, so that when South Africans go to the polls in May next year, we know exactly who is funding the political parties that we're being asked to vote for.
Given how important this bill is going to be for the future of South African politics, and the spokesperson for the presidency, Khusela Diko, saying recently that what is happening at the moment is that President Ramaphosa is speaking to the presidency's legal advisors to get as best advice as possible. Should he not be allowed the time to make sure that he reaches the very best conclusion on this bill versus perhaps putting his signature on it, only for it to be challenged in court by political parties who have already raised objections to the bill in its current form?
Well, firstly, I think the point is that this bill was passed by political parties that are currently represented in Parliament. So I think they've had ample opportunities to make representations there. There was ample opportunity for South African citizens and organizations to make submissions to the parliamentary committee that processed the bill, and that was indeed done. There were 2 rounds of submissions made in the National Assembly and a further round in the National Council of Provinces. So there's been extensive input in this bill. And whilst the President certainly has the right and in fact has the responsibility to ensure that legislation that he assents to is in fact constitutional and meets the requirements of the Constitution, he's had ample time to do so. We know for some months now that the President said that he was taking legal advice on this matter, and it seems that this is now being dragging out for far too long.
Do you believe he's being lobbied to delay the signing of this bill into law, as some have reported?
Well, I've got no evidence to suggest that that is the case. But on the other hand, I wouldn't be surprised if there was an element of lobbying going on, because some political parties may find it somewhat awkward to have their funders disclosed just before an election. So I think this is something that is really necessary in order to strengthen our democracy, to ensure that political parties are properly held to account by the electorate in South Africa. And the right to know who funds political parties, as the Constitutional Court itself has said, forms a critical component of the right to vote itself. So without this knowledge, the right to vote is somewhat weakened or lessened.
One of the concerns then, Lawson, around possible loopholes of this bill is around the threshold for donations that would have to be declared, or where the funder's name would have to be made public, be it the initial 100,000 rand that was said. There was also an idea of a 50,000 rand declaration or a 10,000 rand situation. Do you think that we are possibly staring at an issue where that needs to be strengthened to avoid abuse by political parties and their funders?
Well, the current, threshold limit is perhaps set too high, for all political parties at the moment. But I think we need to work with what we've got, and certainly experience will tell us once we start receiving the information and the data from political parties as to whether that threshold is indeed too high, and whether there are lots of donors that are slipping in under the radar and therefore not having to disclose who they're funding. But I think there's also a moral obligation now, not just on political parties, but also on donors, large donors, corporate donors in particular, to voluntarily disclose when they make donations to political parties. And that's why, if people want to support democracy, the provision is there for this multi-party democracy fund, where donors can donate to that fund, and that money will then be split amongst the political parties represented in Parliament. So that's another way of assisting democracy, but ensuring that all parties benefit from the funds that are made available.
Do you think this bill being passed into law will close the financial taps, if you will, for parties, as some had said before it was finally voted on in Parliament?
I don't think there's any evidence to support that. I think there are many other countries in the world that have stringent regulations on the private funding of political parties, and those political parties in those countries continue to function. And this is a culture of transparency and openness that we need to inculcate to strengthen democracy in South Africa. So this is something that we need to get used to, that people should not always jump to conclusions, but it's the access to that information about donors and relationships and relations with political parties that it will enable the public to scrutinize those relationships, to see whether there is any undue benefit that is accruing to the donors as a result of any donations they make. And this is something that I think we need to grapple with, and it certainly will help strengthen our democracy. I think there's a responsibility on South Africans, on corporate South Africa, to fund the political process, because political parties are an important part of our democratic process in South Africa. They certainly need funds in order to be able to operate effectively, and there's a responsibility on all of us to ensure that they do so, but that they do so in a manner that is appropriate and responsible.
And I suppose the need for funding cannot be highlighted any more than the multi-party fund that this bill would see created in the IEC, where you and I would be able to make contributions to fund our political parties. How far would that go, and how crucial would it be in trying to level the playing field, especially for the smaller parties who don't get as much money?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was done in this bill is that the formula that is used currently by the IEC to dispense public funds to political parties has been changed from the 90-10 formula, which really benefited the larger parties, to a 2/3, 1/3 split between in the formula, which will assist the smaller parties somewhat, but still, enables the larger parties to get the bigger share of the funds, because they have bigger infrastructure to fund and to maintain. But I think it's certainly a step in the right direction. We, for example, argue that the formula should be a 50-50 one, with 50% split on a proportional basis and 50% on an equitable basis. But I think there's been an improvement in this piece of legislation, and smaller parties will certainly find that they're going to have a greater access to resources going forward.
Lawson Naidoo, thank you for your time this afternoon.